senior senator from Iowa is recognized.
Mr. President, soon around the 12:30 hour, or one of the 7 votes this afternoon, we're going to be voting on cloture on the Stock Act. And I have 45 minutes allotted to me to tell you, for me to speak about the disappointment I have with the way this has been handled and why I think the parliamentary procedure is wrong and why the whole process irritates me. Bipartisanship happens to be alive and well here in Washington, D.C., where most of our constituents feel it's never working. Earlier this week, we had the Republican majority leader of the House and the Democrat majority leader of the Senate, and that's bipartisanship, work together to thwart the will of 60 senators and 286 members of Congress. The end result is, as well-meaning as the people behind this maneuver might be, the end result is that 60 members of the Senate are going to be denied an opportunity to pursue what they had previously voted for, and 286 members of the House of Representatives co-sponsoring the language of my amendment are not going to have a chance to do what 286 members of the House wants to do. And as I said, this is bipartisanship, but it's not the kind of bipartisanship cooperation intended or not that this nation deserves. I won't ascribe motives to anyone in this body, but I know that today's actions only serve the desires of obscure and powerful Wall Street interests, and it undercuts the will of the overwhelming majority of Congress that I just described. And it's once again an example of Wall Street being heard in Washington and maybe the common person throughout the United States not having its will expressed. This process took a common sense provision supported by a majority of both houses of Congress, and they simply erased it. In other words, you got to remember here, when you have a 60-vote requirement in the United States Senate, you know what that 60-vote requirement's really meant to do, that no amendment under a 60-vote requirement is ever going to be adopted. And that was surely the motive behind the 60-vote requirement for the amendment that I got adopted when this bill was first up, because the Democrat leader voted against it, the Republican leader voted against it, the Democrat manager spoke against it, and the Republican manager was against it. Now, common sense tells you, if you study the United States Senate, that an amendment like that is never supposed to get adopted. But we got the 60 votes to get it adopted. Quite frankly, I was surprised that we got the 60 votes to get it adopted. And so that is taken out of the bill that we're going to be voting on this afternoon. My amendment simply says that if you seek information from Congress or the executive branch to trade stocks, Congress, the executive branch, and the American people ought to know who you are. Nobody's saying you can't do it, but you ought to know who they are. And you do that through the process that everybody ought to know who lobbyists are. Not that lobbying is illegal or wrong, but it ought to be transparent. And with transparent comes accountability. The same way, this amendment asks these people that are involved in seeking information to just register so we know who they are. The amendment makes nothing illegal, but we ought to know who these people that seek political and economic espionage, we ought to bring all of that out of the shadow into the public's information. But the leadership of both parties, the majority in the House and the majority in the Senate, went behind closed doors and made that provision just magically disappear. What they did was truly amazing, because a handful of senators and congressmen overrides the will of 60 senators and 280 plus backers of my amendment in the other body. First, the majority leader in the House said that the definition of political intelligence was so vague that he couldn't possibly figure out how to define it. That's the excuse given for stripping any regulation of political intelligence, or my words, or political and economic espionage, from the Stock Act when it was taken up in the House of Representatives. Now, let me tell you why that excuse is truly amazing to me, and quite a surprise. Because the House of Representatives put in a diluted provision that uses the very same definition that I had in my bill of what political intelligence gathering is. And then by taking out my language, putting in theirs, they got it done because it was an excuse that the language I had in my amendment was so vague. But you know what? They took that very same language and put it in their amendment, calling for a study of political and economic espionage and political intelligence, and used it. So let me go back to Section 7, Part B, and quote, starting to quote, definition. For the purposes of this section, the term political intelligence shall mean information that is derived by a person from direct communications with an executive branch employee, a member of Congress, or an employee of Congress, and provided in exchange for financial compensation to a client who intends and who is known to intend to use this information to inform investment decisions. End of quote. Now, that's the definition that they thought, we really don't know what political intelligence is, so we shouldn't be passing this amendment, even though 280 members of the House of Representatives has sponsored a bill to do it for the last 6 years. And take that very same definition that they say is so vague and put it in a bill for the purposes of studying something. So that seems pretty straightforward, doesn't it? That definition seems pretty straightforward. Of course, now that definition will only be applied to a study, not to legislation with real teeth, because the powerful interests of Wall Street are winning out. Now, if you think that's bad, this is what happened to the Stock Act in the Senate. By now, I think just about everybody in this body knows how strongly I feel about this amendment that was adopted by this body 60-40. Under a rule requiring 60 votes, because that kills any amendment. But it didn't kill this one, because we were right. I have spoken many times about the dangers of unregulated political and economic espionage. I have reached out to the leadership to express my concern and written a letter with Senator Leahy, the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, on the importance of our Stock Act provisions. I said that I was willing, if necessary, to negotiate on the language of my amendment. And that would be on the question of what is political intelligence. But it seems to me you don't need to negotiate that if the House or if we pass something with that definition in it, and the House already had 286 co-sponsors with that definition in it. And if they take that same definition and put it in the amendment in the other body for a study, not an amendment with teeth. So when I said I was willing to negotiate, What was the response? Nothing. I wasn't even given the courtesy of being notified before cloture was filed. So it's kind of like an ambush, plain and simple. Just like those people who traffic in political and economic espionage, this process has been cloaked in a great deal of secrecy. Now the claim is made that the Senate was forced to take up the House bill because an unnamed Republican was threatening to object to a conference. However, no Republican or any senator, for that matter, has publicly owned up to trying to stop this bill from going to conference. But even if we accept this fact, there are still more questions. Supposedly, we're taking up the House bill because the Senate does not have time to take 2 or more cloture votes. Throughout this Congress, we have spent weeks in nothing but quorum calls, but suddenly we've run out of time. Of course, in less than 10 days, we'll be leaving Washington, D.C. for a 2-week recess. I intend to go home and have town meetings. But we're not going to be doing business here in Washington, D.C. So I have an idea for people to consider. With congressional approval ratings in the near single digits, why can't we spend part of that time getting the Stock Act right? And by getting it right, I have nothing wrong with a basic underlying piece of legislation, but when you have a chance to bring transparency and accountability through the registering of people that are involved in political and economic espionage, I think we ought to do it. And that's what I mean by getting the Stock Act right. The Washington Post said that my amendment, combined with Senator Leahy's political corruption amendment, was, quote, transforming the Stock Act into the most sweeping ethics legislation Congress had considered since 2007. Now, maybe you don't agree with the Washington Post all the time, and I don't agree with them all the time, but you've got them looking at things on a wider scale, and they're saying that a Congress that doesn't have a very good approval rating has a chance for the first time in 5 years to do sweeping ethics legislation that we need to improve the public's reputation, or the Congress's reputation by the public. So, isn't this worth taking just a couple extra votes to get it done right and to make Congress look better? I think so, but apparently a small handful of people in the House and the Senate that make the decisions of how we're going to do business around here, not taking into consideration the votes of 60 senators supporting this, have other ideas. Well, at the end of the day, here's what will happen if we don't proceed. There are about 2,000 people working in the completely unregulated world of political intelligence, or political and economic espionage. Right now, these people have to be celebrating because they're in the shadows. They want to stay in the shadows. They are celebrating because they know that it's business as usual. They can continue to pass along tips that they get from members of Congress, senators, and staff, and no one will be the wiser. They pass along these tips to hedge funds, private equity firms, and other investors who pay them top dollar. The lobbyists get rich, Wall Street traders get rich, but the American people lose. At one time, these folks have set up these meetings for members of Congress, or even in the executive branch, and I have examples to show that. They used to charge $10,000 for just setting up a meeting. Now they don't charge $10,000 anymore because that information got out and was too embarrassing to them. So now there's kind of a relationship built up here between the people that know the way around Congress and people that want this information, that if there's investment in stock as a result of this and there's an increase in the value of stock, that you'll do your trading through the company. That's a tragic result of this decision by the leadership to leave out the amendment that was adopted by 60 members of this Congress and would do nothing more, not make anything illegal, just lets us know who these people are. Through my oversight investigations, I've learned that political intelligence gathering for Wall Street is a growing field ripe for abuse. Here are just two examples of the type of activity that will continue to be kept in the dark. In the course of my investigations of a whistleblower's claim, I learned that the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services has closed-door meetings with Wall Street firms where CMS policies are discussed. No record is kept of the meetings, and employees are essentially on the honor system to make sure that they are not giving investors inside information. As an example, the whistleblower who came to us claimed that over a dozen CMS employees spent nearly 2 hours briefing Wall Street analysts and investigators on the taxpayers' dime. A member of the public could not walk in and get that kind of access to that information. CMS is supposed to be working for us. Instead, we found out that they're working for Wall Street. If my amendment fails, we won't know how many of these meetings occur throughout the government and who profits from these meetings. Another example was an investigation that I conducted into President Obama's administration's Department of Education. The Department of Education was getting set up to issue regulations on gainful employment that would affect not for-profit colleges. Several hedge funds had bet big that those new regulations would make it harder for for-profit colleges to do business. Then news began to leak out that those regulators were not going to be as tough as was expected. Suddenly, for-profit stocks began to rise, and these hedge fund investors reached out to their friends in the Department of Education. This is from an actual email that my investigators uncovered. It was sent from Stephen Eisman, a hedge fund investor, to David Bergeron. He was part of a team in charge of writing these regulations. Quote from the email, "I know you cannot respond, but for your information, education stocks are running because people are hearing DOE is backing down on gainful employment," end of quote. To translate that on Wall Street jargon, the term running means that a stock is going up. Within minutes, this email was marked high importance and forwarded to senior level political appointees. These appointees included James Cavall, the Deputy Undersecretary, and another policy expert at the department, and Phil Martin, the Secretary of Education's confidential assistant. To this day, we do not know why the department's higher education policy experts needed to know that a hedge fund investor was losing money. What we do know is that for-profit stock dropped significantly, and if you bet big that these stocks would drop, you likely made a lot of money. When the Department of Education answered my questions, they admitted to my staff that this email was not a proper contact. In addition, the Department of Education's Inspector General is investigating the gainful employment rulemaking process. These are just two examples in two government agencies, but reports like this are just the tip of an iceberg. The more power Washington, D.C. has, the more it affects financial markets. And the more it affects financial markets, the more people on Wall Street want to pay for information about what is going to happen here in this island surrounded by reality that we call Washington, D.C. Usually, the only way that any sort of ethics reform gets done around here is that someone gets caught. With political intelligence, we have the opportunity to create transparency before the next scandal occurs. As government grows, this industry is going to grow along with the potential for corruption. The question is, what are we going to do about it? Transparency is the simplest and least intrusive solution. And if transparency doesn't do the job, then you can legislate. But I have found out in so many of my investigations over the last 20 years that if you bring transparency to something, get it out in the open, it tends to correct itself. Maybe not completely, but to a great deal. And originally, starting out investigations, you think you're going to have a massive amount of legislation. But when you get transparency involved and the accountability that goes with it, you find out that you don't have to pass a lot of laws, that a lot of people know if somebody's looking over their shoulder that they're going to do what's right. Now, we can commission another study like the House of Representatives wants to do, and we're going to be voting on when we vote on cloture here. But that's kicking the can down the road for another year. But we can act today by defeating cloture and getting to some of these amendments that have such widespread support in the Congress of the United States. 60 votes in the United States Senate and 286 co-sponsors in the House of Representatives. This is our last chance to make sure that the Senate speaks with a unified voice against secrecy for political intelligence agencies or the political and economic espionage people, and speaking out for transparency in government. We must not allow the special interests to operate in the dark. Just bring them out of the shadows. Not what they're doing is illegal, but we ought to know what it is. For these reasons, and to support transparency, to support open government, and to support good government, I will oppose cloture on the bill. And I hope that a lot of my colleagues, in fact, I hope all 60 of the colleagues that voted for the amendment in the first place would oppose cloture. If cloture is invoked, which is likely, I intend to vote for this bill anyway because the underlying bill is a very necessary piece of legislation. But it is not much of a victory for the American people, as the Washington Post said, that if it included the Leahy Amendment, if it included the Grassley Amendment, it would be the most sweeping ethics reform in the last 5 years. I yield the floor, reserve the balance of my time.